The stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the Man from Leng. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, I am reviewing the Mystic cards in the Boundary Beyond, the second Mythos pack in the Forgotten Age cycle. There are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. We are going to take another deep dive into the wonderful world of probability on this episode. So grab your scientific calculator and strap yourself in, because this one could get a little long. We've got two cards to review, and one of those is a new talent that there's a lot going on with it. So let's get started. The first Mystic card in the pack is a new skill. This is Enraptured. It has one intellect skill icon and the practice trait. It has the game text: if this skill test is successful during an investigation, place one charge or secret on an asset you control. The designers have made several attempts to nail the whole add charges to assets mechanic, and I haven't been all that impressed by any of them. Level 1 and Level 3 Book of Shadow are woefully inefficient, while there is a significant chance that recharge a Level 2 Mystic event from a Phantom of Truth will just blow up in your face when you use it, forcing you to discard the asset to which you were hoping to add charges. Enraptured is the first Level 0 card that lets you place one charge on an asset you control. There are many assets that use charges, too many to list here. You can also use Enraptured to place a secret on an asset, although there aren't that many assets that use secrets at the moment. As I mentioned during my review of the Seeker card Truth from Fiction, there's In the Know, Forbidden Knowledge, and Archaic Glyphs Untranslated, and that's about it. Enraptured is a skill which I think is better than an asset such as Book of Shadows or an event such as Recharge. In those cases, you need to take a separate action to gain an additional charge. That's not the case with Enraptured, which essentially lets you piggyback the charge on another skill test. The big issue I have with Enraptured is not the charge, but the nature of that skill test. You can only commit Enraptured to a skill test during a good old-fashioned investigation action, and that means using intellect. The problem, of course, is that some mystics don't use intellect to investigate. They use other tools such as Drawn to the Flame and Rite of Seeking. Mystics love Drawn to the Flame because it lets them discover clues without making a skill test, while Rite of Seeking lets mystics use their willpower instead of intellect during a skill test. This is huge for intellectually challenged mystics such as Agnes Baker and Akachi Onyele. Both cards let mystics discover 2 or even 3 clues at a location, depending on which level of Rite of Seeking you're using, something they simply cannot do by taking a vanilla investigate action. If Enraptured had a willpower skill icon instead of an intellect skill icon, I would be all in, because it would certainly help you stretch your Rite of Seeking charges that much further. As it stands, Enraptured is kind of at odds with well-established mystic tactics. Now, I could see playing Enraptured in combination with Flashlight in a solo Agnes or Akachi build to add a charge to a spell, but I highly doubt you're going to choose Flashlight over Rite of Seeking in either Investigator if you're playing in multiplayer. I don't see either Agnes or Akachi taking many vanilla investigate actions in multiplayer, because that's not really their job. They're usually there to kill the enemies with their damaging spells. If they want to play Enraptured, they're probably going to have to commit it to a skill test during another Investigator's investigate action. And if you've got a Seeker in your party, they probably don't need the help from a card like this. So I really don't see Enraptured being worth the card slot in this particular case. While I don't think Enraptured is a good fit for either Agnes or Akachi, I could see playing it in several other Investigators. The most obvious contender is a spell-slinging Daisy Walker build. Daisy is much more likely to take vanilla investigate actions, and she shouldn't have too much trouble passing them with an intellect of 5. Enraptured could give Daisy a little help on those high shroud locations and an extra charge for Shriveling or Mists of Rillier, depending on whether she's playing offense or defense. Archaic Glyphs Translated is a tome, so it makes sense to play that card in Daisy. She could use Enraptured to help her translate the glyphs and then fuel them once she has purchased one of the upgrades. Enraptured is also an interesting option to consider in a Marie Lambeau deck. Marie has an intellect of 4, and she can take Seeker cards, which means she can use cards like Deduction in her deck if she wants to discover extra clues. Spells are Marie's bread and butter, so an extra charge on a Shriveling is always welcome. Like Daisy, Marie can use Archaic Glyphs Untranslated, so Enraptured can pull double duty, translating the glyphs and fueling the upgrades. Enraptured may also find a home in a hybrid Jim Culver build. Jim can lean heavily into Seeker to help a group gather clues, reserving his spells for offense or defense as he sees fit. I don't think Enraptured's going to make the cut in all Jim decks, but if your Jim deck happens to be a backup Clover, then a copy of Enraptured may not be a bad idea, just to add a charge to one of your spells. I've been pretty hard on cards that play around with the whole adds charges to assets mechanic, but I think the designers may be onto something with Enraptured. I quite like the idea of generating extra charges without having to waste an action to do it. It's highly unlikely that I'll play the card in Mystic and off-class Mystics who are planning to rely on Drawn to the Flame or Rite of Seeking to discover clues. However, Daisy Walker and Marie Lambeau could certainly put it to good use, especially if they go the Archaic Glyphs route and can use that secret to translate the glyphs and then use Enraptured to add charges to it once they upgrade to the spell. I could also see certain Jim Culver builds who also may benefit from a copy or two of this particular card. The next card in the pack is Recall the Future. It's a 2-cost asset that costs 2 experience points. It has Intellect and Agility skill icons and the Augury and Ritual traits. It has the game text Response. When a skill test you are performing begins, if Recall the Future is ready, name a Chaos token. If the named Chaos token is revealed during this skill test, exhaust Recall the Future. Then you get +2 skill value for this skill test. Mystics have an unusual collection of talents compared with the other classes in the Arkham Horror LCG. Level 0 and Level 2 Arcane Insight, talents from the core set and Return to the Night of the Zealot respectively, are the most traditional since you may pay a resource to boost either your willpower or intellect skill value. Blood Pact, the Mystic talent released in Blood on the Altar, breaks with the other talents in that pack since it requires investigators to add Doom to Blood Pact to gain skill value bonuses, and you don't want to be doing that too often, otherwise you're going to just rocket through the agenda deck. Finally, there's Grounded, the Mystic Composure talent from Echoes of the Past. Grounded is similar to Arcane Studies in that it requires resources to fuel it, but it breaks with the other Composure talents in that pack because investigators may use it only during skill tests on spell cards, which is much more restrictive than the other talents in that pack. As you've probably noticed by now, each of the talents in the Boundary Beyond has a unique triggering mechanism that is often quite thematic for the class. Seekers place clues on locations, rogues spend resources, while survivors discard cards from hand. So it should really come as no surprise to anyone that Recall the Future involves the Chaos Bag. If you name the right Chaos token before pulling from the bag, you receive the +2 skill value bonus. Otherwise, you get nothing. We've seen this type of mechanic used before in the class. Defiance, the Mystic skill released in Blood on the Altar, also forced investigators to guess which Chaos token they would pull. So Recall the Future is very much in keeping with Mystic themes we've seen so far. I think there are some players who are going to take one look at Recall the Future and just write it off because unlike the other talents in this pack, there is no guarantee that you'll get the skill value bonus when you use it. After all, you've got to guess which token you're going to pull, which isn't going to be easy when there's 12 or so unique chaos tokens in the bag. That really begs the question, how do you know which token to name before you pull from the chaos bag in order to maximize the benefit that you get from Recall the Future? There are two factors to consider before you name a chaos token, those being the number of tokens with the same face that are in the chaos bag and your investigator's skill value before you pull from the chaos bag. The first factor is determined by the campaign. In the Night of the Zealot and the Dunwich Legacy campaigns on standard difficulty, -1 is the most common token in the bag. In fact, there are 3 of them. There are also 2 zeros, 2 -2s, and 2 skulls. All the other tokens in that bag are singletons. The Path to Carcosa campaign changes things up, adding 3 -1s and 3 skulls to the bag. There are also 2 zeros and 2 -2s. Finally, the Forgotten Age changes things up again with 3 zeros, and there are also 2 -2s and 2 skulls. The number of tokens in a chaos bag tends to fluctuate during a campaign, but it's safe to say that the most common token in the bag at the start of the campaign will more than likely still be the most common token in the bag by the end, unless you've had a particularly bad run of bad luck during a campaign and you've ended up filling the chaos bag with extra tokens. The second factor to consider is your investigator's skill value before you pull a token from the chaos bag. Unfortunately, this involves doing a little bit of math, so let's take a look at a practical example. Now, before I go any further, I feel as though I should issue a warning about probabilities and the chaos bag. The probabilities that I'm discussing here are not written in stone. The odds of a successful pull from the chaos bag are subject to change depending on many factors, including the contents of the bag, the nature of the scenario, and the level of difficulty that you're playing on. It's important to keep in mind as you consider the information that follows, because odds are going to be different in your particular campaign. So with that in mind, let's assume that we're running Father Mateo through Threads of Fate, the third scenario in the Forgotten Age cycle. I've decided to use Threads from Fate as the example in this scenario because the Chaos Bag is relatively easy to model. Depending on what happened during the first 2 scenarios of the campaign, there could be as many as 16 Chaos tokens in the bag. I'll assume the contents of the Chaos Bag look a little bit like this. There's a +1, 3 zeros, a -1, 2 -2s, a -3, a -5, 2 skulls, a cultist, a tablet, an elder thing, the tentacle, and of course the elder sign. We'll also assume there are no cultist enemies in play, so the skulls are a 0. The skulls also happen to be a 0 if you are playing Jim Culver, so it's nice this example also applies to him as well. As you can see from the Threads of Fate scenario card, all the other special tokens in the bag are -2s. Since we know the contents of the Chaos Bag, we can calculate the odds of drawing a token based on its rarity. If you name a token that is a singleton, say the Elder Thing for example, you've got only a 6.25% chance of pulling that token. If you name the -2 instead, of which there are 2, your odds double to 12.5%. Finally, if you name the 0 token, of which there are 3, your odds will triple to 18.75%. Let's take a look at how this plays out during a skill test. Let's assume Father Mateo is 2 down before the pull. Now, most investigators are going to fail this test, but Mateo has a slim chance, a 6.25% chance in fact, of passing if he can pull the Elder Sign. If Father Mateo has Recall the Future in play and names 0, which is the most plentiful token in the bag, his odds of success jump to 25%. Mateo's odds in this case have gone from slim to none to 1 in 4, which is pretty significant. Now, those odds aren't great in the grand scheme of things, but at least he's got a chance of success, which is more than most investigators can say when they are 2 down before the poll. If Father Mateo is 1 down before the test, he has a 12.5% chance of success because he can either pull the +1 or the Elder sign. However, if he names the 0 token with Recall the Future, his odds of success jump to 31.25%. In both cases, Mateo's odds improve by 18.75% because he named the 0, which again is the most common token in the bag. Now, Mateo's odds will improve if he names a token other than the 0, but the impact is somewhat less. Let's assume he's even with the skill test difficulty before the poll. In this case, Mateo names -2 since zeros are already considered successes. His odds will improve to 56.25% from 43.75%. If Father Mateo's skill value is 1 greater than the skill test difficulty before the poll and he names -2, his odds of success improve to 62.50% from 50%. As you can see, his odds improve by 12.5% in both cases, which is in line with our expectations for the Chaos Bag. Now, Recall the Future is also helpful if you name a single token in the Chaos Bag, but as you can probably guess by now, its impact on the odds drops off dramatically. For example, if Father Mateo's skill value is 2 up before the poll, his chance of success soars to 81.25%. If he uses Recall the Future to name the -3 token, which is one of only 3 tokens in the bag, that can cause the test to fail. His odds increase by only 6.25% to 87.50. As you can see from this example, Recall the Future's impact on the odds decreases as the rarity of the token increases. That brings us to the next question, and that is, how does Recall the Future compare to the resource-fueled mystic talents, such as arcane studies? Before I answer that question, I need to talk briefly about how players have approached the Chaos Bag since the core set. Generally speaking, there's a rule of thumb in the Arkham Horror LCG that on standard difficulty, you want your skill value to be 2 greater than the skill test difficulty before the poll. 2 is the magic number because every card and resource you commit to the test above that threshold is subject to diminishing returns. That rule of thumb certainly holds true in this example. If Father Mateo is 1 up before the poll, he has a 50% chance of success. If he's 2 up, his odds soar to 81.25%, which is a 31.25% increase. That's huge. However, if he commits 1 more card or resource, his odds only hit 87.50. Clearly, you don't get as much bang for your buck after you hit that +2 threshold. So with that in mind, let's return to the previous question about the comparison between Recall the Future and Arcane Studies. The easiest way to answer this question is to do a little bit more math. The following chart compares Father Mateo's chance of success if A, he triggers Recall the Future, B, he triggers Arcane Studies and spends 1 resource, and C, he triggers Arcane Studies and spends 2 resources. As you can see, spending 1 or 2 resources to trigger Arcane Studies is always better than triggering Recall the Future, with 2 exceptions. Those are A, you're 2 down before the poll and you can only afford to spend 1 resource, and B, your skill value equals the skill test difficulty and you can only afford to spend 1 resource. I think the numbers are particularly telling when you consider a situation where Father Mateo's skill value and the skill test difficulty are the same. Triggering Recall the Future or spending 2 resources to trigger Arcane Studies both provide a +2 skill value bonus, but the odds of success are remarkably different, 56.25% versus 81.75%. Now, the reason for this disparity is that the two skill bonuses are not the same. If Father Mateo triggers Recall the Future and he names the -2 token, he will receive a +2 skill value bonus if he pulls a -2, but he's going to fail the test if he pulls a -1 or any other token with a value of -2, which in this case includes the Cultist Tablet and Elder Thing tokens. If he dumps 2 resources into Arcane Studies, he's got blanket coverage against the -1 token and any other token with a value of -2. So does this mean Recall the Future is objectively worse than Arcane Studies? Not necessarily, because Recall the Future has several advantages over the resource field talents. First, it's non-unique, so you can have 2 copies on the table, which doesn't really work with Arcane Studies. There's really no point to having 2 copies because they'll both do the same thing. And you can use, if you do have a second copy of Recall the Future on the table, you can use it to target the same token for a cumulative bonus of +4, or you could target 2 different tokens, providing greater coverage of the Chaos Brag. Second, Recall the Future isn't fueled by resources, which can be in short supply if you're paying for a lot of expensive Mystic assets. And third, you can use it on any skill test, not just willpower or intellect skill tests, or in the case of a card like Grounded, skill tests on spell cards. However, I think it's really important to emphasize here that if you trigger Recall the Future with the expectation that you're going to hit that +2 threshold in Threads of Fate, that being that 81.75% chance of success, you are going to be sorely disappointed. Recall the Future isn't going to get you there, at least not by itself. Recall the Future has several advantages over Arcane Studies, but the numbers suggest those advantages come at a cost, namely a reduced odds of success. Fortunately, Mystics have several other tools at their disposal to play around with the tokens in the Chaos Bag, which in turn will help them get a little bit more oomph out of Recall the Future. These tools include cards such as Grotesque Statue, Ritual Candles, and Defiance, Dark Prophecy, all the cards that seal tokens, and all of MCBRIDE, a Mystic ally who is coming out in the next Mythos pack, Heart of the Elders. Let's take a brief look at how each of these cards interacts with Recall the Future. Now, all of these examples assume that Father Mateo's skill value is equal to the skill test difficulty, and he names the -2 token with Recall the Future. If he does all that, his base chance of success is 56.25%. So some of the numbers you're going to see here are whether he'll go up or down from that base value. First up is Grotesque Statue, the asset from the core set that lets you reveal 2 tokens from the Chaos Bag and choose one of them to resolve. If Father Mateo uses the statue, his odds of pulling at least 1 success improve to 82.50%. Obviously that's great, although that combination is going to set you back at least 6 experience points. Next up is Ritual Candles, a Mystic asset from the Dunwich Legacy that gives you a +1 skill value bonus if you reveal a Skull, Cultist, Tablet, or Elder Thing. The candles don't improve Father Mateo's odds of success if he names the -2 in this case, since the skulls are already 0s and the Cultist, Tablet, and Elder Thing tokens are -2s, so that +1 bonus from Ritual Candles isn't going to be quite enough to put him over the top. If Father Mateo names the Cultist, Tablet, or Elder Thing token instead of the -2, his chances of success actually drop slightly to 50%, and that's not particularly inspiring, and I am not sure I would be using Ritual Candles in this particular scenario. Defiance, a Mystic skill released in Blood on the Altar, lets you choose either the Skull, Cultist, Tablet, or Elder Thing and ignore its effects, including its modifier, if you draw it from the Chaos Bag. If Father Mateo plays a Defiance, his odds rise to 62.50%. Since he can only target a single token, I think Defiance would work much better in a campaign like the Path to Carcosa. In that case, Father Mateo could name the -1 with Recall the Future and then target the Skull with Defiance, and that would improve his odds significantly. But if you just have to name, if your only option is to name a singleton, you're not going to get much of a boost if you're using Recall the Future with in conjunction with Defiance. Dark Prophecy from the Forgotten Age Deluxe expansion is another option. Dark Prophecy lets you reveal 5 Chaos tokens, but you must choose to resolve one of the tokens with a special symbol. Father Mateo has an 89.42% chance of pulling at least one token with a special symbol. Since the skulls are already zeros, Father Mateo is better off naming the cultist tablet or elder thing. That means he's got about a 3 out of 5 chance of that a special token is a success. So his odds of success in this case are quite good. Father Mateo can also try using the seal mechanic. It is in his wheelhouse after all. I discussed the seal mechanic at length during my review of the Mystic cards in the Forgotten Age, and I'm not planning on revisiting it here. Suffice to say that sealing a single Chaos token has very little impact on the odds of success. If Father Mateo uses a protective incantation to seal a Chaos token, say the -5, which is a pretty bad one, his odds improve to 60%, which is a paltry 3.75% increase. Seals work a lot better if you go all in on the strategy and seal as many tokens as possible, but that in itself takes time and resources, and adding Recall the Future to that mix I think is asking a lot. That's one more action you're going to have to take to get the card in play, and 2 more resources in addition to all the seal cards. Finally, there's Olive McBride, a Mystic asset coming out in Heart of the Elders. Now, typically I don't discuss cards that are coming out in the future, but I think I'm going to make an exception in Olive's case because she does work particularly well with Recall the Future. Olive is an ally that lets you draw 3 tokens from the Chaos bag, but you have to resolve 2 of them. Now, Olive is one of the most difficult cards to model since there are so many different combinations of tokens that you can pull. However, if there are roughly 9 quote-unquote good tokens in the bag, the +1, the 3 zeros, the 2 -2s, the 2 skulls, and the Elder Sign, Father Mateo has a 95.60% chance of revealing at least 1 good token and a 65.39% chance of revealing at least 2. Now, you'll still fail the skill test if you draw the wrong combination of tokens, such as, say, 2 -2s and the -5, but I still like the odds that Olive gives you of success. Olive is particularly good because, unlike Grotesque Statue, she is a level 0 card, so you can slot her into your deck right at the beginning of the campaign. Based on the examples here, I think it's safe to conclude that Recall the Future becomes a lot stronger with each additional token you draw from the Chaos bag. Cards such as Grotesque Statue, Dark Prophecy, and Olive McBride boost Recall's odds significantly, while cards that target single tokens such as Protective Incantation and Defiance barely move the needle. If you're playing Recall the Future, you may want to consider playing 1 or more of the cards that I've listed here to give it a shot in the arm so you can hit that at least 81.75% chance of success, or higher in some cases. Of all the cards in the pack, I think Recall the Future is one of the most difficult to judge. Since the game's release, players have become accustomed to throwing cards and resources at skill tests, hitting that magical 2 up before the pull through sheer brute force. Recall the Future encourages players to take a different approach, manipulating the individual tokens in the Chaos bag to tip the odds in your favor. After spending several days poring over the numbers, checking and double-checking my calculations, I think Recall the Future has its merits, especially if resources are an issue. For starters, it gives investigators a fighting chance on tests they have no business passing. If you're 1 or 2 down before the pull and hope of passing the skill test seems lost, you can always name the most common Chaos token in the bag and just see what happens. Suddenly, there's a little bit of light at the end of that dark tunnel. Recall the Future also improves your odds of success considerably if you are even or 1 up before the pull. This may encourage players to attempt more skill tests at reduced odds, letting them save cards and resources for those do or die skill tests where failure is simply not an option. Now, Recall the Future can also help you with those particular skill tests, but if you're already 2 up before the pull, Recall the Future's effect is pretty subtle, perhaps a little too subtle for most players to notice. Personally, I think I prefer the certainty that comes with pouring cards and resources into skill tests, but I can see Recall the Future's advantages. It's not quite the same as going 2 up before the pull, but it's not as resource intensive either. And if you happen to be already playing cards like Olive McBride and things like Grotesque Statue, then I don't think you can go too wrong by including Recall the Future in your deck as well. That's going to do it for my review of the Mystic cards in the Boundary Beyond. Enraptured it's a fresh take on the whole adds charges to assets mechanic, which designers were pushing back in the Path to Carcosa. I like the bonus charge, although the card seems targeted at investigators such as Daisy Walker and Marie Lambeau, rather than the hardcore mystics such as Agnes Baker and Akachi Onyele. Recall the Future, on the other hand, continues the streak of offbeat talents for mystics. Now, I know there are quite a few players out there who are excited about this card, but after running the numbers on it, I'm not entirely convinced that it's worth the investment without the other cards to support it. There are quite a few pros to using this card over traditional talents, especially the fact that it doesn't require resources and you can use it on any skill test. However, it appears that versatility comes at a cost, since the odds aren't quite where I would like them to be if I exhaust Recall the Future. Judging by the examples I provided, the card works best in combination with other cards that let you reveal multiple tokens during skill tests. Of all the cards in the pack, this is the one that I really struggle to wrap my head around the most, so I would certainly encourage you to play the card for yourself and draw your own conclusions. This is one card that I am prepared to be mistaken about, and I guess we will find out in the future whether I was right or wrong about Recall the Future. That's going to do it for my review. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, remember to check out the reviews for the other cards in the other classes when you've got the chance. They're all in a playlist there for you. If you need to contact me, I can be reached at manfromleng@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromleng. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.